As we come to the final session of today's conference, we shift gears to a conversation that brings together many of the themes we have explored: identity, representation, and the complex ways Hinduphobia manifests in public spaces. Throughout the day, we have examined how Hinduphobia operates through media narratives, policy, education, and even therapeutic practices. But what happens when these dynamics play out on one of the most visible stages, American politics? Our closing session is a live interview with Bhavini Patel, a second-generation Hindu American and former congressional candidate from Pennsylvania's 12th District, who has experienced firsthand the complexities of navigating public service as a Hindu American. Bhavani ji's campaign illuminated how Hinduphobia emerged in political spaces, including surprising spaces like progressive circles that often champion inclusion. Her journey reflects not just the personal challenges of running for office as a minority, but also the broader questions of representation, bias, and belonging for Hindu Americans in public life. Leading this conversation, we have Dr. Indu Viswanathan ji, Director of Understanding Hinduphobia and a scholar whose work explores Hindu identity, education, and the impact of colonial narratives on contemporary understanding of Hinduism. Induji's research delves into how educational and public institutions construct knowledge about Hindu traditions, and her writing centers Hindu voices in education and public discourse. In tandem with her academic work, Induji is a longtime disciple of His Holiness Sri Sri Ravi Shankar. She draws deeply from Hindu wisdoms, traditions, and is committed to challenging the erasure of Hindu thought in public life. This conversation will explore how Hindu Dharma influences public service and leadership, what it means to face Hinduphobia both from the political left and right, the rising representation of Hindu Americans in politics and what that means for the community, and strategies for navigating identity in public spaces while staying true to one's values. Please join me in welcoming Bhavni ji and Indu ji for this important and timely conversation.
Thank you so much, Adhya, and welcome Bhavani ji to this conversation. It's delightful to see you again. We're going to dive right in.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Wonderful. So first, you grew up in the Pittsburgh area. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what it was like to grow up Hindu in that part of the country?
Yeah, so I grew up in Monroeville, which is one of the suburbs in the Pittsburgh area. I went to Gateway K through 12, basically spent my entire life here. Did my undergraduate studies at the University of Pittsburgh, and then left for 2 years to get my master's at the University of Oxford, and then came back home. And so deeply rooted in the Pittsburgh region and committed to just the growth of this area. My family is originally from Gujarat. My mom actually raised my brother and I as a single mother, and we moved around a lot actually, and until she and then decided to make Pittsburgh home, largely because she started a catering business here as a result of the Patel brothers that is here in Pittsburgh. And so she supplied samosas and rotis, and then one thing led to another, and she started a food truck business. And so I spent my summers working in the food truck business, running the counter and just helping out. And I think that had a significant impact on my upbringing and my proximity to just the culture, the food, language. My mom was very adamant about making sure that we were, familiar with our faith and rooted in that identity, language, traveling back to India when we had the opportunity. And so, Pittsburgh is a really special place.
Absolutely. And you've nicely queued me up for my next question for you, which is, how has that upbringing, that Hindu upbringing and that connection to your ancestral land and values shaped your commitment to public service?
That's a really interesting question. And so I think that there's a couple of aspects to this. I think growing up, one of the biggest themes that my mom instilled in us was a sense of duty and responsibility to do good. This concept of seva, right? Doing things without having an expectation for a particular outcome, and doing something because you believe it's the right thing to do, or doing something because it's what pulls you. And I think that was something that I really leaned on very heavily during my congressional race. When you take on the endeavor of running for federal office, or any office for that matter, you really have to dig deeply inside of yourself and have an answer to your why, especially on the most tough days. And so, my connection to my Hindu identity and the ability to actually explore that through this congressional campaign is something that was not something that it was something that I did not anticipate. And it actually in many ways brought me closer to my faith and to my identity, and has really taught me the importance of taking ownership of that and really exploring what Hinduism means to me and how it allows me to engage with the world and how it shapes my public service. And as somebody who, is 31, in some ways I'm quite sad that it took me this long, but I'm glad that, now, as I think about my career and my professional growth and my personal relationships, there is this guiding framework.
Right. And actually that leads me to my next question. There are more Hindu Americans involved in public service today than I think we've ever really seen before, across the aisle. So what does this increase in representation signify, do you think, for the community?
Look, I think it's a positive thing, right? I mean, I think the ability to see Hindu names on a national stage, a global stage, uh, is and that sense of familiarity, I think, is something that's really really unique and special. Growing up, for us, I at least for me, I don't recall having that example. I actually spent about 2 years of my undergraduate career thinking that I wanted to become a physician, and then traveled abroad and spent 2 summers in Tanzania, and then came back and realized that I didn't want to go into medicine. And had I had the example of what it would be like to see my values and my food and my culture and things that were familiar to me growing up reflected in the national political landscape, maybe that's something that I would have arrived at sooner. So I think it's in some ways it's a normalization of Hindu identity at that stage, but with that, I think also comes significant challenges in controlling the narrative and taking ownership of it, right? When you see that sort of growth happening so quickly, there are some people who have the ability to misrepresent an entire faith and an entire people. And unfortunately, I think it's kind of interesting. We're seeing this growth of representation at a global stage, but it's like when we think about the grassroots mobilization and the activation at the local level, it's almost like we're not quite ready to meet that moment, to be able to control the narrative and to be able to respond to the misrepresentation of what it means to be a Hindu. And I think that's simultaneously a challenge, but because that challenge exists, it's also an opportunity for us as a Hindu community to work on that. And so that's why, I think that this conversation that you and I are having here is so critical. And I'm glad to see that it's taking place.
Absolutely. So let's dig in a little bit to what happened with your race, your run. You ran as a Democrat, but you faced significant Hinduphobia from groups affiliated with the political left. Was this surprising to you? And what was that experience for you personally?
So yes, so I am a Democrat. I've been a Democrat my entire life, and so I was running in the Democratic primary in Pennsylvania's 12th congressional district. And we were focused on a lot of really important issues that were impacting, the average American, everything from, living wages to healthcare. We were having some really critical conversations, and sadly, actually, inherently, this campaign was historic for a lot of reasons. As a young woman to be running for Congress and coming from the background that I did, I think that there was a sense of hope and excitement around what we were building here. And it was something that actually resonated not just in this district, but also nationally. And, we were able to garner a lot of attention and conversation and excitement, everything from just wanting to be a part of the campaign from a social media aspect to wanting to contribute donations. And so inherently, the conversation grew so large. And sadly, I think that there was a turn that took place where the influence of just my Hindu identity and the Hindu community at large wanting to take an interest in this campaign somehow was used against us. And so there was an article that was written that was actually talking about what misrepresenting what the meaning of Bharat is, for example, talking about what it means to say Jai Shri Ram, for example. And so we were really dealing with a lot of negative backlash as a result of me owning my Hindu identity to a point where it actually, became quite dangerous. Personal attacks, social media. There were public events where my family's food truck was actually present for some events, and we were kind of heckled, and it was not a good experience. And I think ultimately the thing that really shocked me was at the end of the day, it was the media misrepresentation, the dual loyalty tropes, and the sort of things that have dangerous implications, especially when you're running for federal office in such a high profile campaign and you're owning your Hindu faith. It almost normalizes the ability for people to attack you. And and that was just something that, no one, I don't think anybody could ever be prepared for something like that. And to learn it and to learn how to respond to that on the fly was really a challenge. But I think that we did a really remarkable job of owning the narrative and trying to course correct and learned a lot of lessons that still have implications for activation and grassroots organizing here in the 12th district.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Left-leaning spaces often pride themselves on pluralism and inclusion, yet Hinduphobia frequently emerges in progressive political circles. Why do you think it exists in spaces that claim to champion diversity and minority rights? You've touched upon it a little bit, but maybe let's unpack some of those examples that you listed.
Yeah, so I think inherently, so there's I think there's two layers to this, right? The first layer is that this was a Democratic primary. It was a political race, and so there are certain. I think you would think that there are certain moral lines, or the idea of a moral compass that you would follow, and you would operate saying that you're not going to go out of your way to misrepresent a person's faith, or you're not going to sort of sink to that level. And sadly, we live in a world right now where the desire for this sort of political power really has brought the worst out of people. But there's also this other component to it, which is the speed of which information travels, right? When something is said, it can be tweeted, and before you know it, there's hundreds, thousands of retweets. And is that, who's going to see if that's fact or fiction? And so that's, I think, the first aspect of it. The second aspect of it also is, as a Hindu candidate running and sort of owning my faith, the access to resources to be able to counter that misinformation and do it at that rapid speed when you're sort of being attacked and people are internalizing this misinformation as truth. How do we disseminate information into the mainstream channels to set the record straight with fact and experience, right? And sort of owning the narrative. And I think that is the challenge that we face right now is owning the narrative and understanding how to get that information into the mainstream as opposed to allowing people to sort of talk about us without centering, us as a people.
Right. And I think that that's also a matter of taking advantage of the multiplier effect of social media that works against us, that worked against you, and harnessing that for a narrative change. Yeah, absolutely.
That's actually a really good point. And it's also just so fascinating, right? Because it's sort of counterintuitive to how so many of us were brought up, right? It's this idea of you are supposed to, you know, go to college, get a degree, get a job, this concept of sort of laying low, like toe the line, we came to this country. We should be so appreciative of everything that we've been provided as a result of this great country, which all those things, so two things can be true at the same time, right? You can be appreciative of this reality, but also want to claim your space. And I think that we're sort of in the trajectory of wanting to, I hope, claim our space, and evolving to develop the toolkits to be able to do that.
Right. And I think it's all, I mean, I think I really resonate with that mindset that you shared, sort of like, maybe our parents immigrated here, don't rock the boat, right?
Right.
Just lay low, be a good girl, be a good boy, concentrate on your studies and everything will work out. What happens when our boat is being rocked by these narratives, right? What can we
Yeah.
do? Right? It's not really an option anymore. Um, how much of the bias that you faced during your campaign was based on your identity as a Hindu American or Hindu versus assumptions about your stance on India-related issues?
Yeah, very rarely actually I don't think I was ever actually asked directly my views on India or the Modi administration. It was never actually about policy. Um, it's been a few months, but if I remember correctly, I don't think I was ever directly asked that question. And so there were a lot of assumptions that were made that, if this woman is so vehemently owning her Hindu identity, she inherently must be pro this or anti this. So there was never space created for me to actually set that record straight. And you could automatically almost see that there was inherently that it was almost intentional, right? It was intentional to be able to use that as a tactic to other, that this person doesn't reflect our values. This person um, is committed to the agenda that in a faraway country, is not actually rooted. It doesn't have your best interest here. What's happening in this community at heart. If there were space created to be able to correct that, then it wouldn't have stuck. And that was inherently the challenge that we were facing, was how to disseminate information quickly enough to be able to set that record straight so that it wouldn't, so we could actually talk about the beauty of a Hindu woman running for office, what that means for the country, what that means for this community, what it means for diversity and inclusion and all of the really great things that we value in this country. And I think that we were able to accomplish some of that. I'm certainly not the first Hindu candidate that's been attacked in this way, but I think I am one of the few candidates that was attacked that leaned into this as an opportunity to say, no, this is wrong, and here's why it's wrong. And it was incredibly difficult to do that because, political communication inherently is just a beast of its own. And then when you start talking about the nuances of Hindu identity, Hindu phobia, these terms that are just not mainstream, and you're introducing an entire community, an entire public to something that's so new, and you have to do it in a constrained timeline, which is a campaign timeline. You're dealing with significant challenges, right? But one thing that I think that we successfully accomplished was bringing that conversation to the national stage. Um, and the conversations are still continuing, and today's a good example of that. I'm still being invited to talk about the experience that I had, and hopefully, it inspires other candidates or other members of our community to take ownership of that and to lean into it and use those experiences, which feel very negative and can be very traumatizing, use them as an opportunity to educate. So.
Right, absolutely. And I think what's sticking out for me and what you're describing is that there are almost these like very handy conflations that are made between identity and politics or worldviews or whatever it might be. And it's almost like said with a wink, like, well, everyone knows what that means. And so these attacks are just leveraging the manufactured ideas in the public imagination about what identifying as a Hindu means, not just in term, I mean, certainly not in terms of what you can contribute to American society, but perhaps even how you're a danger to American democratic ideals.
That's
Um,
exactly right. And that's the part where it actually gets dangerous, right? Because you're validating you're validating people's response, negative responses to you. And sometimes that can be verbal, but sometimes it also crosses the line and can become physical, right? And to validate that and to unleash that on a people, um, it's that's where I think I realize that, that's where we draw the line, and we have to engage. We have to start building and investing in the infrastructure to educate, and it's not okay, and silence sort of is not an option at this point, right?
no, no, I mean, at this point, it's burying our heads in the sand if that's what we're choosing. Yeah, absolutely. I want to take a moment because I think we've spent a good amount of time on the political left, but let's just talk about the political right a bit, right? We know that Hinduphobia is agnostic to the political aisle. It appears on both sides. I know you may not have had the opportunity to experience it as much from the political right, but did you experience any attacks from the right during your campaign or before or after?
So it was a Democratic primary, so I did not directly experience this, but I think one thing that is clear is that it's this sense of sort of extremism that exists on both sides. I think that leads to the toxicity and sort of um, the misrepresentation and the the sort of dangerous flow of information that that sometimes is not rooted in reality. And inherently, I think, given the space that we're talking about, there's always sort of a political intent behind that, right? It's never actually rooted in this idea of wanting to create change, or it's never really values driven. It's driven by this sort of thing that's not not necessarily rooted in an inclusive nature. And so I think that in and of itself is sort of it's a different kind of beast to attack. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think I certainly do believe that there are challenges on both sides.
Yeah. Well, and what I'm hearing is that you might enter from the door of public service, but very quickly you're ushered into politics and people taking action around what's politically expedient. And it's no longer really around public service.
And I think that goes back to your original question, right? Which is such a good question to start the conversation with, which is why. What do how are you rooted in your Hindu faith and what keeps you going? And at the end of the day, there were mornings where I would wake up and I would think, why am I doing this? Especially on the hardest of days when you know that the attacks are coming or the articles are going to be written, and that you have to wake up and fight another fight. You really have to believe in this sense of public service, the sense of responsibility, the duty, and really detach yourself from the outcome. And I think only when you're able to do that are you really fighting a values-driven fight. And look, I don't think it's going to get easier. I wish I could say that it was, but I think that if you do intend on running for office and you're going to center your Hindu faith, it's not an easy world out there. I think but that inherently also I think represents an opportunity.
Right. I want to go back to a question I asked earlier, but kind of reframe it a little bit, which is with all of these Hindu Americans in public office, whether they're framing their positions as politicians or public servants, what does it mean for America and for American democracy to have Hindus in the position of public servants?
I think it's about time. I mean, I think that, Hindus bring a lot to the table in terms of, aspiring for the American dream, finding that reality, owning that reality, the cultural diversity, the ability to engage on an international stage. I'm based in Pittsburgh. We're home to Carnegie Mellon University, the University of Pittsburgh. The amount of minds that come here, start companies, raise families here, start small businesses, join companies, are working, that's a significant economic footprint that we have in this country. And, we give so much that I think at some point it's, we must politically activate to be able to see that through, to build a stronger foundation and to ensure that, our contributions to this country and to its growth and to make sure that it's, um, are rooted in longevity. I think that's a really powerful thing. And so, yeah, I think that's the case for Hindus. I think that's the case for many ethnic groups and many faiths. And I think that it's about time, and I'm glad to see that we're owning up to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, a question I have because we're co-hosting with a Hindu youth organization. What words of advice would you have for young Hindu Americans, maybe even current college students who are thinking about entering a life of public service?
I would highly encourage it. I think it's an opportunity to shape the narrative, especially right now when there are a lot of you know um, successful political figures who are shaping the narrative and bringing positive change to the country. I think that there are examples, positive examples, and showcase that you can build an entire career and really make some positive change and lead in a career of public service. I necessarily did not have that growing up, so I think that's a really special thing. And I would also say, especially for young people right now on college campuses, it's not easy. I mean, we do a lot of work here organizing in partnership with the Jewish community. So there's a strong relationship between the Hindu and the Jewish community here. And I've spent some time talking to students on college campuses, particularly Jewish students, and the challenges that they're facing as it relates to anti-Semitism, and have simultaneously also worked with our local Hindu YUVA chapters, and this concept of Hinduphobia on campuses, being able to identify it, even to know, right, that that's actually what's happening, those microaggressions, knowing that as a student you have the ability to respond to it as opposed to feeling like you can't respond. There are a lot of lessons to be learned, and I think that we need to be able to cultivate those young voices and those young minds. And if we can build the systems and structures to nurture that, I think that's a really powerful thing.
Absolutely. I think that's a really wonderful note to leave off on. But I will say, I hope and I think that your campaign was the beginning of your career in public service and not the end. And I look forward to seeing where you go with this and with the lessons that you learned, the lessons you have to, and the things you have to teach all of us. And if I could, as sort of a older sister type of note, I'm very proud of you, and I'm very grateful for, putting yourself out there, because I know that it's not easy. And all of my blessings and luck as you continue this work in the
That's
public.
very sweet. Thank you so much. And it was really, really lovely chatting with you. And thank you for the invitation to be here today.
Thank you so much. Namaste.
Namaste.
Dhanyawad, and thank you so much, Bhavini ji and Indu ji, for this thoughtful and deeply resonant conversation. Navigating public life as a Hindu American is complex, layered, and often challenging, especially when bias comes from unexpected directions. Bhavani ji's experiences remind us that representation alone isn't enough. It's about ensuring that Hindu voices are heard without distortion, dismissal, or politicized assumptions. This conversation also challenges us to reflect on what it means to stay rooted in Dharma while practicing in spaces that can be both hostile and welcoming in complicated ways. As we think about the future of Hindu representation in politics, we must also consider how to build spaces where Hindu Americans feel seen, supported, and empowered to lead without compromising their identity. Thank you again to Bhavini Patel ji and Dr. Indu Viswanathan ji for that powerful conversation to close out our final session. Hearing about the complexities of navigating identity, public service, and Hinduphobia in American political life was a fitting end to the day, filled with deep reflection, critical insights, and meaningful dialogue.